So since the governors and the people of the states were powerless against the Klan, the question becomes, what actions did the federal government take? The Klan-like groups grew bolder in 1870, and the death toll mounted into the hundreds. Southern Republicans were desperately petitioning the national government, and Republicans in Washington tried to help out. A stumbling block to legislation against the Klan was the federal system, under which the states had jurisdictions over the crimes of murder, assault, arson, and the like. The enforcement clauses of the 14th and 15th Amendments seemed to provide constitutional sanction for federal action. On May 31, 1870, Congress passed an enforcement act that made interference with voting rights a federal offense punishable in federal courts. The key section of this law defined as a felony any attempt by one or more persons to deprive another person of his civil or political rights. During the first year of the law's existence, President Grant and Attorney General Hoar did little to enforce it. However, by 1871, it was clear that the government's soft tactics were failing. Klan violence was on the rise. Grant and his new Attorney General Amos Ackerman readied the iron fist. On February 28, 1871, Congress passed the Second Enforcement Act, which established the machinery necessary for the federal supervision of registration and voting. The most important law that was passed was the Enforcement Act, passed by a special session on April 20, 1871, popularly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. This law strengthened the felony and conspiracy provisions of the 1870 law. It authorized the president to use the army to enforce it and empowered him to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in areas that he declared to be in a state of insurrection. KKK Act also gave the courts power to purge suspected Klansmen from jury by an oath backed with stiff penalties for perjury. With these laws in place, the Grant administration finally cracked down on the Klan. Government detectives from the Department of Justice and the Secret Service infiltrated the order and gathered evidence of its activities. In 1871, a congressional committee also conducted an investigation of the Klan that produced 12 volumes of testimony documenting its outrages. The president sent several companies of cavalry south to cope with the fast-riding Klansmen. But because Grant was sensitive to Democratic charges of military despotism, he used his power sparingly. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in only 9 counties of South Carolina. There and elsewhere, especially in North Carolina and Mississippi, federal marshals, aided by soldiers, arrested thousands of Klansmen. Hundreds of others fled their homes, and some fled to Canada to escape arrest. Federal grand juries handed down more than 3,000 indictments. Several hundred defendants pled guilty in return for suspended sentences. The Justice Department dropped charges against nearly 2,000 others in order to clear the clogged court dockets for trials and other major offenders. Of those convicted, most received fines or light jail sentences, but 65 were imprisoned for sentences of up to 5 years in the federal penitentiary at Albany, New York. Most arrests of Klansmen took place in 1871 to 1872, though their trials dragged on until 1875. Government's main purpose was to destroy the Klan and restore law and order in the South, rather than to secure mass convictions. As a result, the 1872 election was the fairest and most democratic presidential election in the South until 1968. At the time, it seemed as though the Klan and its campaign of terrorism had been crushed. Thus, the courts granted clemency to many convicted defendants, and Grant used his pardoning powers liberally. Despite Grant's restraint in enforcing the KKK Act, bayonet rule became a central issue in the 1872 election.